Hello there, friends. Welcome to BJJ Meditations. This is BJJ Meditations episode number 90. I'm your host, Joe Hannan, Joe from Jersey, coming at you at a later hour than I normally record this podcast. That's been the big sticking point the past couple of weeks. I've had to change my training schedule. I've had to overhaul my work schedule, and it's just been a matter of finding a convenient, conducive window to recording this podcast. So apologize for the previous missed weeks. I think I've got it sorted out now, and we'll be back to our regularly scheduled introspective nightmare. Speaking of introspective nightmares, I've had an interesting couple of days here, which I'd like to share with you, mostly selfishly for myself, to process them a bit better. But yeah, it all started, this saga started last, I want to say it was Tuesday. Yeah, it was last Tuesday. I went for my annual eye exam, and I was relieved to find out that my prescription had not changed. So my eyesight, despite spending hours of my day staring at a computer screen, has not deteriorated beyond its already currently shitty status. But the optometrist noticed something that she perhaps had not noticed before, or that was a recent development. She noticed that my left pupil was about 0.5 millimeters smaller than my right pupil. And 0.5 millimeters in size difference doesn't really mean all that much in the grand scheme of things, but that slight difference can portend some pretty ominous health consequences. It can be indicative of head trauma. It can be indicative of a hemorrhage in the brain or brain cancer. Either way, it's generally not good. Fortunately, both of my pupils were reacting to light, meaning they were changing size and shape like they should be, but one was smaller than the other. So she said if they were not changing size, we would immediately have to refer you to the emergency department, but right now I suggest that you follow up with your primary care provider. So I went home, I did that, and of course, I couldn't get in to see my primary care provider because who the hell can? One of the major limiters of our healthcare system in this country. You got to schedule visits with your primary care provider months in advance. And if you're sick, you're almost always better off going to an urgent care center where the doctor has no idea who you are and generally may not even care, as was the case with the doctor that I would later see. So I got in my car, went to the nearest urgent care center, and got looked at first by the nurse, checked me in. She said, oh, that's strange. Everything seems okay. Let me talk to the doctor. So I'm listening to her recap the account I gave to the nurse, and the doctor is mostly silent. And all of a sudden, he kind of bursts into the room, just looking. He was wearing a mask. But his eyes were kind of wide, and I could tell right away just by his presence and his energy that he was putting out that this man was very nervous. And he asked me to again retell the history, which is pretty much SOP for any medical professional. They have you repeat your story ad nauseum. I guess they're looking for differences in accounts that they can use as incriminating evidence at a later time. So I'm telling him what happened, and he's looking at me, but I can tell that he's not listening. I'm watching his eyes dart back and forth nervously above his mask, looking into my eyes. And I could tell that he'd already made up his mind about me and about my situation before the words could come out of his mouth. But eventually they did, and he said, there's nothing I can do for you here. We don't have a CT scan, and you need a CT scan. So you understand, right? There's nothing I can do for you here. And I said to him several times, because he asked the question several times, that yes, I do understand that there's nothing you can do for me here, and that I agree this is an absurd proposition to send somebody who potentially has a hemorrhage to send them to a primary care office, but I tend to be one to follow procedure unless the procedure is exceedingly absurd, so here I am. And the subtext of this whole thing was that this guy was not listening to me and was not really interested in my case because he was more interested in covering his ass from a liability standpoint, because there was nothing he could technically do for me in that moment. But what he proceeded to do was put the fear of death into me by saying that based on what I'm seeing here, you may need neurosurgery within a few hours. If this is the result of a concussion you sustained from jiu-jitsu, you got what precipitated this was I had taken a hit to the head a couple nights prior, so I wondered if that might have been a contributor. And then I got hit in the head again in the same spot a few nights later. And he said, I understand this is just the nature of what you do, but in the NFL, if you get 2 concussions, you're done for the season. So best case scenario, you're done for jiu-jitsu for 8 months. And worst case scenario, there's going to be a surgeon cracking open your skull within the hour. Of course, he didn't say it in those terms, not the skull part, but he did say the NFL concussion part. So I proceeded to get in my car and drive to the nearest emergency department. And the entire time I was pretty freaked out, but also weirdly detached and placid. It was almost like I was 2 people. And the detached and placid person was saying to himself, wow, I didn't have brain surgery on my scorecard for today, but here we go. Started out at the optometrist's office, and I might be having my skull sawed open within a few hours. So got to the emergency department. Eventually, it was enormously crowded, which was kind of surprising for a Wednesday afternoon or a Tuesday afternoon. Eventually got seen by a physician's assistant because there, I guess, were people there who were in worse shape than me, or required the attention of physicians. No slight at all to PAs whatsoever. I just, understand how hospital triage works. And she looked me over and consulted with the physician who she works with, and they said, you don't have any signs of head trauma. This could just be sort of like an anomaly that nobody detected before. We're kind of the mindset that you should just follow up with an ophthalmologist and go home. But, we believe in shared decision-making for patients. And if you would like to do a CT scan, we'll do that for you, just to have the peace of mind. And I had this moment where I was like, oh, great, I can go home. This is awesome. I'm going to go do that. I haven't eaten anything all day at this point. But I was immediately brought back to this moment when I had just been married to Frances, and I was driving home from work, and my commute at the time was pretty long, and I would try and make it as fast as possible by barreling down the left lane of the New Jersey Turnpike, or 287, at fatal speeds if I were to get into a crash. It's a pattern in my life. I don't drive this fast anymore. And then I just realized, like, I can't die anymore. Somebody depends on me. There's somebody waiting for me to come home. It was like my life had another layer of meaning added to it that I hadn't accounted for previously. So I'm sitting in this emergency department, and they're literally ready to show me out the door to set me free. And I decided that I was going to do the CT scan just because, there are people who depend on me, and I need to know what's going on with my brain. Unfortunately, the CT scan came back negative. Everything looked fine. I still don't know why my eyes are messed up. I still haven't followed up with the ophthalmologist because we were going to be leaving for Georgia within a few days. So I figured I'd do that now when I'm back. And had this realization as I was driving home from the hospital of like clarity, and just like I'd been given a whole second chance on life. I went from being under the impression that I was going to be having brain surgery to just walking out and driving home in my Subaru. Just went from extremely dramatic to extremely mundane, just like that. And the next thought out of my head was, well, I guess I'll go home and eat something and train some jiu-jitsu. I'll go to Tuesday night class. And that's what I did. And I had one of the best nights of training that I have ever had, where I was able to just absorb the lesson, immediately put it into play, have success with the technique against skilled opponents. My live training rounds were great. Everything felt amazing. And I came away from it thinking, how do I bottle up this feeling of clarity and hold on to it? How do I savor the importance and the salience of today, and how do I bring it to bear on all of my interactions and all of my days? And as these things tend to go, I slipped back into the mundane. I went to Georgia with my family to visit my in-laws. Cormac had a great time playing with his cousins. His grandparents had a great time playing with him. It was just, your run-of-the-mill American family experience. But prior to that, I trained jiu-jitsu on Wednesday afternoon, and I had physical therapy on Wednesday afternoon too, which I've been doing for my ankle. And I woke up on Thursday morning and my right knee was kind of swollen. And I really didn't know why. It just was swelling. There was no standout moment in my mind during live training or during class on Wednesday when I was teaching where something felt weird or there was an injury. But it's not like my knees to just swell up like that. And I kind of just held it in the back of my mind. The entire time I was in Georgia, it would get better, it would get worse. And I just went about my business. I exercised regularly. I did all the things I've normally been doing. And yeah, I went about my business. I trained jiu-jitsu last night. Finally, I had physical therapy again this morning, and I had the chance to tell my physical therapist about it. And she's like, okay, yeah, I'll check it out. It could have been something that we aggravated when we were doing plyometric stuff for your ankle. And I'm laying on the table and she's feeling around. And she says, yeah, I can feel your meniscus here is a little bit inflamed. And immediately I just felt like all the oxygen gets sucked out of the room in a way that the oxygen did not get sucked out of the room when I thought I was moments away from having neurosurgery. It's hilarious to think about in this moment, the different responses between them. But there was like a real radical and acceptance and fatalism to the brain bleed that needed to be operated on versus my meniscus, because I've always had this tremendous underlying fear in jiu-jitsu of knee injuries, just because they're one of the few things that you have a hard time bouncing back from. Like I had a really bad MCL tear right before Cormac was born, and it just messed me up so bad. And I didn't give it enough time to heal. I went back too soon. I just kept making it worse. In so many ways, his birth was a blessing, but in one of the smaller ways, it forced me to take like a month away from training and let the damn thing heal. But even then, I came back and I kept pissing it off because I just had this compulsion that so many of us in jiu-jitsu have to train. We get so much value and stimulation out of the struggle that is jiu-jitsu, and it becomes so interwoven in our identity that we can't imagine life without it. And I think the pandemic taught me that I can be fine without jiu-jitsu. Life goes on without it, but life is certainly better with it, and losing it has always been a fear, particularly when it comes to knee injuries. So my PT is checking it out, and at one point she says something to the effect of, well, this, it could be a bucket handle tear, and that's why you might feel it lock out or stiffen up. And I was thinking to myself, like, yeah, that's not what I'm feeling. That hasn't happened at all. Why are you even saying that? It really just feels like swollen and slow to move. There was never any moment of pain. There was never any moment of instability. It just, the best way I can describe it is it just doesn't feel like my knee. It feels like it's a little bit asleep, but it doesn't feel unsteady or anything like that. So we talked a bit, and she seems to think that this is something that will just resolve on its own. And we're going to see what it's doing on Friday, since tomorrow will be a day since the injury. But, I think that aside from being apart from jiu-jitsu, or at least having to train in a modified capacity for a while, these sort of things, they're a forced confrontation with our own mortality. I think that people like me who work in jiu-jitsu, who work in the coaching space, we hold ourselves to such high standards because we know that we need to be examples for our clients and for our students. And I'm somebody who likes to lead from the front, and I like to model the behavior that I like to see in other people. And this, to me, is like, there's almost like a shame inherent to injury like this. How could I let this happen to myself? How could I let my team down, my tribe down, my people down in this way, which of course is totally absurd, but feelings don't have to be rational. And the more we try to make them so, the more frustrating it becomes. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's also this forced confrontation with our own mortality. Like, I want to do this forever. And of course, that is inherently absurd because I will die someday. But even beyond that is a layer of truth that, or underneath that is a layer of truth that things fall apart. You know, our bodies can only do so much. And there are a number of things you can do to age more gracefully, but age you will. And I certainly feel my age right now. You know, I have this weird ticky-tacky injury to my knee. I have this ankle sprain that just like won't heal. And I have a lot of important stuff going on in my life that I feel requires my attention. But I can't attend to it in the way I want to because I'm limited by my own mortality. And I'll also say this fear of missing time on the mats, it doesn't change when you become a black belt. It's still there. There's a maturity, I think, to my outlook now where I'm like, yeah, I know I can survive a long layoff. Like, worst case scenario, I'd be looking at 6 to 8 months of recovery if this required surgery. And I know that jiu-jitsu would be there waiting for me on the other side. And I know that I would find my way back to the mat. And I know that it would be frightening in the same way that returning after COVID was frightening. But I also know that I've done this before and I've been there. That's the absolute worst case scenario. And I like to keep these things in perspective because I've witnessed just this past year 2 catastrophic injuries of people, grapplers whom I care deeply about. And then another one of our coaches whom I hold in high respect and care very deeply about just had his meniscus go, presumably, and it was surgically repaired prior. So it just raises all these questions of how can something we love so much can also be so destructive? How can it give us so much and take away so much at the same time? And how does it continue to break us? And yet we keep coming back for more. It sounds like an abusive relationship sometimes. But I return to this idea that ultimately the underlying attraction of jiu-jitsu is not a destination mindset. You don't arrive at black belt and have arrived. You know, it's this process of becoming. And we're all, regardless of whether we're martial artists, on about this process of becoming. Some of us are doing it more consciously than others, but when you take on an art like Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, it gives you a tangible, relatable experience of becoming that runs in parallel to your overall development as a person. And it's a mirror, and you're surrounded by people who see that value, who love the process just as much as you do. And you're all kind of pulling each other along. You're all just being pulled along by this magnetism of becoming. And I think that's the most heartbreaking aspect of it all when you're hurt, is that in some ways that gets put on hold. But the consolation is that it's always going to be there waiting for you. I say this for myself. I say this for whoever else out there is listening, dealing with injuries of varying severity. Jiu-jitsu will always be there for you. That's all I got for you this week. It's late. I need to ice my knee, wind down for the evening. If you're ever interested in coaching services, you can hit me up. BJJ Meditations at gmail.com is the best way to reach me for either of those things. I've been really enjoying the strength and conditioning work that I've been doing lately with myself and for others. It feels like a very strong place for me to be, no pun intended, in terms of alignment of my interests and my values in jiu-jitsu. It's all about longevity for me. And that's partially why this little injury is such a blow, even though in the grand scheme of things, it's not that big of a deal. Because I want to help people stay in the game for as long as possible to continue being about this work of becoming. So if that is appealing to you, hit me up, bjjmeditations at gmail.com. And finally, this Sunday, we will have the second installment of the PBJJ book club. We will be discussing what were we discussing? Alan Watts's book, Taboo. It's, what is the title? It's got kind of like a long, funny title. Yeah, that's right. It's often called The Book, simply The Book, but the subtitle is On the Taboo of Knowing Who You Are. It's about Vedanta in some ways, and it's also about Jiu-Jitsu in some ways. If that's interesting to you, I will put a link in the show notes where you can register and attend via Zoom. Of course, if you're in the Princeton area, you're more than welcome to come in person. That's going to be Sunday at 7:30 p.m. Be from 7:30 to 8:30. Other than that, that's all I've got for you folks. I've got a fun episode, which I think I will release next week with Jake Luigi of Outlier Database / Less Impressed, More Involved Jiu-Jitsu, and Josh Liu of 1-800-BJJ Help, where we discuss the intersection of hunting and jiu-jitsu. And then I have, at some point, a to-be-released episode where Jake and I were doing a coaching call, or I'm sorry, Josh and I were doing a coaching call, and he said, hey, you know, you're recording this with Fireflies, like, why don't you put this out so people can see what a coaching session with you is like? And I said, sure, why not? If you think it's useful to people, great. You know, steal the fire. Use the approach for yourself. So that's coming out too. And of course, we've got merchandise. I want to get that up and going before the holiday season. I just haven't had the time to build a web store on the website. That's on my to-do list this weekend. So that's the best way to support the podcast will be to buy shirts, 2 designs, one for my good buddy Diego over at Power Trip Worldwide, and then another design from Jamie, who did the logo for the podcast. So if you're into that, buy some merch when it's available. I will let you know when. Other than that, thanks for listening, folks. Be of good health. Listen to your body. Take care, and we will talk next week.